I have tracked Iran's nuclear file for over a decade. I have watched negotiations collapse in Geneva. I have read the IAEA's inspection logs. I have followed the centrifuge numbers through every cycle of diplomacy and pressure. I have never seen anything quite like what is sitting on the table right now. Not the ceasefire, not the naval standoff in the Gulf, not the back-channel talks moving between Doha, Vienna, and Islamabad. There is one number, a single number that is holding this entire situation in place, and almost no one in mainstream coverage has explained what it actually means. That number is 440. 440 kilograms. That is the quantity of uranium Iran currently holds, enriched to 60% purity, confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency's own auditors. Now, I want to be honest with you. When most people hear 60% enrichment, they assume that's high, but they don't know how high. And that gap in understanding is exactly why this conflict makes no sense until you understand the science underneath it. So stay with me for the next few minutes, because once you see what 440 kilograms at 60% actually represents, geopolitically, militarily, and in terms of raw physics, you will understand something that 3 months of news coverage has genuinely failed to communicate. In 2015, Iran signed the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under that agreement, Iran agreed to cap its uranium enrichment at 3.67%. For context, civilian nuclear power plants typically require enrichment between 3 and 5%. Weapons-grade material requires 90%. The JCPOA was engineered specifically to keep Iran far from any meaningful weapons threshold, capping the total stockpile at 300 kilograms and embedding international inspectors across every major site. For a few years it held. Then in 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement. Sanctions returned. Iran's economy contracted sharply, and Tehran made a deliberate strategic calculation. If the benefits of compliance were being stripped away, there was no longer a strategic rationale to maintain the restrictions. By 2021, Iran was enriching to 20%, then higher. By early 2025, the IAEA was reporting 275 kilograms enriched to 60%. By June 2025, when the United States and Israel launched military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, that figure had climbed to 440.9 kilograms. Very few analysts have spelled out clearly what happened next. The strikes targeted 3 sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. President Trump described the results as having obliterated those facilities. It was strong language, and it was not accurate. The IAEA's post-strike reporting told a different story. Director Rafael Grossi confirmed in March 2026 that the bulk of Iran's 60% enriched uranium stockpile was still present, mainly stored in a tunnel complex beneath the Isfahan nuclear facility, with additional material believed to be held at Natanz. Satellite imagery from early 2026 showed new construction being erected over a previously damaged building at Isfahan. That is not the behavior of a program that has been crippled. Iran had dispersed its most sensitive materials before the strikes hit. This is not a program that was degraded. This is a program that adapted, buried its leverage underground, and walked into the peace talks with its deterrent still intact. And here is where it gets harder to ignore. IAEA Director Grossi stated this on the record in early 2026. The material Iran holds, if processed just one further technical step to 90% purity, is sufficient to produce more than 10 nuclear warheads. Not close to sufficient, more than 10. The breakout time, the technical term for how long it would take Iran to produce enough weapons-grade material after making the decision to do so, is no longer measured in years. It is no longer measured in months. Depending on how much centrifuge infrastructure survived the June strikes, some analysts now estimate breakout in weeks, some say days. That window, the window in which the international community could detect and respond to a move toward weaponization, has essentially closed. That single fact is the reason a peace deal does not yet exist. If that kind of analysis, the kind that goes underneath the headline rather than simply tracking it, is what you come here for, make sure you are subscribed to Nexa World Brief. These breakdowns are built from primary sources, IAEA reports, diplomatic transcripts, and named officials. Your support keeps this work going, because what comes next is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Let's talk about what is actually being negotiated, because this is where the picture stops matching the headlines entirely. The United States has 3 connected demands regarding Iran's nuclear material. First, the existing stockpile must leave Iran entirely, handed to Washington, destroyed on site, or transferred to a neutral third party. Full removal. Second, Iran must halt all uranium enrichment. Third, that halt must be permanent or at minimum last 20 years. Trump's team coined a phrase for this position: no dust, no dollars. No removal of the uranium, no sanctions relief, no release of frozen Iranian assets. Iran's position is equally clear and deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than dismissed as obstruction. On the stockpile, Iranian negotiators initially signaled willingness to discuss a transfer to a third country. Then last week, Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who assumed power following his father's assassination in February 2026, issued a formal directive. The uranium stays in Iran. It does not leave. Senior Iranian officials explained the reasoning through back channels, and the logic is strategically coherent even if Washington will not acknowledge it publicly. Surrendering the stockpile in Tehran's framework removes the only deterrent preventing another strike. The material is not a weapons program, it is an insurance policy. Remove it, and there is nothing standing between Iran and a future military campaign with no deterrent consequence whatsoever. On enrichment, Iran has offered a 5-year moratorium. Washington has demanded 20. The Islamabad talks, which ran for 21 hours straight, collapsed specifically on this gap. Iran's deputy foreign minister was explicit on record: if the United States insists on permanently ending enrichment, there is no deal. In Iran's legal framework, enrichment is a sovereign right guaranteed under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which explicitly permits enrichment for civilian purposes. On a middle option, Iran has proposed downblending its 60% material to approximately 20%, a level that still has legitimate civilian applications but is measurably further from weapons grade. Some arms control analysts, including those at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, have described this as a genuine, if partial, concession. Washington has rejected it as insufficient, arguing the underlying centrifuge infrastructure capable of reaching 60% would remain fully intact. According to Reuters, the Iranian delegation in Doha cannot even agree to removal of the uranium if they wanted to. The Supreme Leader's directive sits above them. This is not a negotiating team asking for more to concede later. This is a new Supreme Leader, younger, less experienced diplomatically, and by every account harder line than his advisors, issuing a binding order that his own diplomats cannot override. Now here is the insight that most coverage is missing entirely. The United States walked into these peace talks believing the June 2025 strikes had eliminated Iran's nuclear leverage. That belief shaped Washington's entire negotiating posture. The assumption was that Iran, with its facilities degraded, its production capacity damaged, and its economy under blockade, had little left to bargain with. That assumption was wrong. The strikes removed Iran's ability to produce new enriched material at scale. They did not remove the material that already existed. And that material, buried in hardened tunnel complexes beneath Isfahan and Natanz, is the most consequential bargaining chip on the table. Because as long as it exists in tunnels that even B-2 stealth bombers could only partially reach, Iran's deterrence has not been eliminated. It has simply gone underground. Let's connect this to the 3 broader systems this uranium question is pulling on, because it does not exist in isolation. The first connection is Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated 3 conditions for considering this conflict over. The enriched uranium must leave Iran, Iranian support for proxy militias must end, and Iran's ballistic missile program must be dismantled. The uranium removal is not just a U.S. demand, it is Israel's stated precondition for ending the Lebanon conflict, where Israeli forces are still conducting operations, and where more than 3,000 casualties have been recorded since the conflict expanded in March. Trump reportedly reassured Netanyahu in a recent call that he would not sign any final agreement without stockpile removal. But the tentative memorandum of understanding currently being negotiated, a 60-day ceasefire extension that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and lift the naval blockade, does not address the uranium in any detail. The nuclear question has been deliberately deferred to a negotiating window that follows the MOU, if the MOU is ever signed. This creates a structural problem that no one in these talks has publicly acknowledged. Israel's condition for ending the Lebanon war is satisfied only when the uranium is gone. The uranium question is deferred to a future negotiation. The Lebanon conflict therefore remains active, and the ceasefire in the main U.S.-Iran theater rests on a framework that has not been signed, has not been approved by either Trump or Iran's supreme leader, and does not resolve the core issue it was designed to address. The second connection is the Strait of Hormuz and global energy markets. The tentative deal includes Iran clearing sea mines from the strait and permitting unrestricted commercial shipping in exchange for the U.S. lifting its naval blockade of Iranian ports. Brent crude peaked above $100 per barrel at the height of the conflict. Approximately 150 tankers are currently stranded in the region, waiting. Airlines, shipping companies, and insurers have been absorbing extraordinary costs since February. If the deal collapses over the Iranian question, which is as of today, the most probable failure point, the Strait of Hormuz stays contested, oil prices remain elevated, and the inflationary pressure feeding political volatility across Western economies continues to compound. The third connection is the man who issued that directive. Mojtaba Khamenei is new to power. He is untested diplomatically, and the order he issued, prohibiting the uranium from leaving Iran, was not floated through back channels as a negotiating signal. It was a formal directive confirmed by two senior Iranian officials and reported by Reuters. It is, as far as the public record shows, his most consequential unilateral act since assuming power. What that tells you is something more important than the directive itself. The question is no longer just what is on the table. The question is who has the authority to move it. To understand where this goes, you have to understand where this has been before. In 1994, the United States and North Korea signed the agreed framework. North Korea agreed to freeze its plutonium program. The U.S. agreed to supply fuel oil and help construct light water reactors. It was at the time described as the diplomatic solution to a nuclear standoff. By 2002, the agreement had collapsed. North Korea expelled inspectors, withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and by 2006 had conducted its first nuclear test. The parallel to 2026 is not perfect. It is, however, instructive. In both cases, a state with a developing nuclear program agreed to constrain, not eliminate its capability, in exchange for economic relief. In both cases, the underlying question of whether the program would survive long-term was never fully resolved, merely deferred. And in both cases, the side with the nuclear material concluded that surrendering it entirely was a strategic error it could not afford. The 2015 JCPOA tried to thread that same needle, constraining Iran's program without eliminating it and buying time through sunset clauses and verification. That arrangement did not fail technically. It failed because neither side trusted the other to sustain it indefinitely. What is being negotiated now is supposed to be harder and more permanent than the JCPOA. But the negotiating positions suggest neither side has moved substantially from where they stood when the war began. Iran enriched to the edge of weapons capability as leverage against future attack. The United States struck Iran's facilities to remove that leverage. The material survived. And now both sides are sitting in conference rooms in Qatar and Pakistan attempting to draft language that resolves a contradiction that military force did not. Let me give you the three scenarios clearly, because this is where the next 60 days will be decided. Scenario 1, a limited deal goes through. The Memorandum of Understanding is signed. The Strait of Hormuz reopens. 150 tankers begin moving. Oil prices stabilize. The uranium question enters a 60-day negotiating track in which both sides test whether a third-party custodianship arrangement, one that satisfies Khamenei's sovereignty concerns while satisfying Washington's non-proliferation demands, can be constructed. This is the scenario global markets are currently pricing as most likely. The gap between most likely and certain, however, remains extremely wide. Scenario 2, the deal collapses before it is signed. Trump's additional demands on Lebanese ceasefire conditions, on frozen Iranian asset sequencing, and on Hormuz verification mechanisms prove incompatible with what Iran's supreme leader has authorized his team to offer. The ceasefire phrase, further skirmishes occur in the Gulf. The diplomatic track is set back by months. Economic warfare intensifies. Energy prices resume their climb. The political costs inside Western democracies continue to accumulate, and the pressure to find a different solution grows. Scenario 3, a resumed military campaign. Defense Secretary Hegseth has stated publicly and on the record that the U.S. military is prepared to go on offense and can restart operations at a moment's notice. He has referenced the June 2025 strikes as a precedent. He has said directly that if Iran refuses to surrender the uranium, the United States will take it. This scenario carries risks that no military press briefing has addressed honestly. An attempt to physically destroy or seize enriched uranium stored in hardened underground tunnel complexes is a fundamentally different problem than the initial June strikes. The material is dispersed. The targeting problem is harder. The radiological contamination risks of striking deeply buried nuclear storage sites have not been publicly modeled, and any military action against Iranian nuclear material risks triggering a response targeting energy infrastructure across the Gulf region, affecting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar simultaneously. The Shadow Committee of Regional States currently watching these negotiations knows this. The Gulf Cooperation Council members have been quiet for a reason. A third military escalation in this theater does not remain contained. Here is the deeper truth that the architecture of these talks has not answered. Both sides have defined their minimum acceptable outcome in terms that cannot be simultaneously satisfied. Washington defines success as a region in which Iran does not hold the material or the capability to build a nuclear weapon. Tehran defines survival as maintaining exactly the capability that prevents a future strike from proceeding without deterrent consequence. Not different priorities, not different timelines. Structurally opposed definitions of what the end state looks like. A deal that fully satisfies Washington leaves Iran in the position of having surrendered its only remaining deterrent to a country that struck it militarily 8 months ago and has not ruled out doing so again. A deal that fully satisfies Tehran leaves Washington having accepted a near weapons-capable program within weeks of breakout, run by a regime that just fought an active war with U.S. forces. The JCPOA tried to split this difference once. It bought roughly 7 years before it collapsed under the weight of distrust. What replaces it, if anything does, will have to solve a problem the JCPOA was never designed to solve, not just constraining the capability, but answering the question of why each side believes the other will honor the arrangement this time. That question does not have an answer yet, and if the next 60 days produce one, it will be the most consequential diplomatic development in the Middle East since the Abraham Accords, and arguably since the original JCPOA was signed. The power vacuum created by the elder Khamenei's assassination, the IRGC's uncertain internal coherence following the June strikes, and the economic warfare compressing Iran's options from below all converge on a single decision point. One stockpile, one directive, one 60-day window that may or may not open. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a choke point for roughly 20% of the world's traded oil. The numbers that flow through it or do not appear in your fuel costs, your grocery bills, and the inflation data that shapes central bank decisions in every major economy. This is not distant geopolitics. This reaches you. So I want to leave you with one question, and I want you to think about it seriously. If Iran's new supreme leader is unwilling to let the uranium leave, and if Washington is unwilling to accept a deal that leaves it in place, and if military action cannot fully eliminate what is already buried underground, what does a genuine resolution actually look like? Is there a framework that has not been proposed yet? Is there a third-party arrangement that satisfies both sovereign deterrence and non-proliferation demands? Or has this conflict reached a point where the positions are simply irreconcilable by conventional diplomacy? Drop your analysis in the comments. The most thoughtful responses always come from this community, and right now that debate matters. If this breakdown gave you clarity that you were not getting elsewhere, subscribe to Nexa World Brief. We will be tracking every development in the 60-day window if it opens and every consequence if it does not. The next move in this story will not arrive quietly, and when it comes you will want to already understand the board.